Okay, the last lesson we did distance, and even though it says distance and midpoints, okay, we kind of ran out of time. It's a lot to pack into one lesson, so we just did the distance last lesson. This time we're going to do midpoints. So let's talk just briefly about what a midpoint is. We've talked about endpoints, we've talked about the distance between 2 points, but let's talk about what a midpoint is. The midpoint would be the point that's, where do you think? In the what? The middle, right? But in geometry, we don't normally say in the middle. We're a little bit more specific than saying in the middle. Do you remember that lesson on betweenness, on things being between? Well, this time, let's do this. Let's say A, B, and then C. I'll tell you what, instead of calling it C, let's call it M. Why do you think I called it M? Yeah, probably for midpoint. So M is between A and B. That's very true. But watch what happens. There's a little thing we're going to be using the rest of the year. What if I put it like a little slash through here, a little slash through here? We actually call this a tick mark. Tick mark. All right. What does that do? Well, what that does right there, that shows you, that tells you what line segments are actually equal to each other. So if between one point and another point, you see this little slash, this little tick mark right here, that means that that length is equal to the other segment that has one tick mark on it right here. Sometimes if you wanted, you could put 2 tick marks. Now, what if I had this? What if I had this was 1 tick mark and this has 2? That means that they would not be equal to each other. But what if they had the same amount of marks, tick marks on there, then they would be equal. They would be congruent. I think I should have said that in one of my other lessons, but if the 2 line segments have the same exact length or measure, we call them congruent. And we have a symbol for congruent. It looks like an equal sign with a little squiggly on top of it. I think I was supposed to do that in like about 2 lessons ago, I think. 1 or 2 lessons ago. Well, anyway, now I've said it, okay? So these would be congruent to each other. If these 2 segments are congruent and M is in between A and B, then this right here would be your midpoint. Midpoint. Now, again, a lot of times we think of it, okay, it's in the middle or it cuts it in half. But the definition of midpoint, it's a point that divides a line segment into 2 congruent or 2 equal segments. A lot of times I'll just substitute the word equal for congruent. Sometimes I'll say congruent, sometimes I'll say equal. Some geometry teachers have a real hard time, would have a hard time with me saying equal, because they're like, well, the segments are congruent. Their lengths are equal, but the segments are congruent. Yeah, that's true. It's kind of like a technicality, but I'm perfectly fine with saying, okay, this line segment is equal to this line segment. Or you could say it's congruent, whatever you want to say. It's fine with me. All right, I think you got the idea. So in order for this to be the midpoint, what does it do? It divides that whole AB, that whole line segment AB, into 2 congruent segments. So that means that the length of AM, okay, would equal the length of MB. Oops, that's supposed to be a B. There we go. That's a weird B. So AM equals MB. If that's true, then M right here, if these 2 segments are equal to each other, these 2, this point right here must be the midpoint. All right, the midpoint. So what we're going to do today is we're going to figure out how to find the midpoint given some lengths. Do you remember our little McDonald's talk the other day? Let's make this a little thicker. And let's make it white. There we go. All right, here's our road. And let's say this time we're right here. All right, in my cool car. Remember my cool car? Yep. And then I got a buddy of mine that's over here, and he lives kind of far away. And he doesn't really want to drive all the way to my house, and I don't really want to drive. Oh, look, we have the same car. And I don't want to really drive to his house, and he doesn't really want to drive to my house, okay? We're pretty far away. So we make this deal, and we said, hey, let's meet. And where else would we meet? How about let's meet at McDonald's, okay? And so we don't have to, so neither one of us has to drive any further than the other person. So what we try to do is we try to find a McDonald's that's halfway in between, or at the midpoint of where both of us are starting. So this would be the midpoint. And oh, look at that. I just happen to have a McDonald's sign here. How about that? Isn't that convenient? All right. So I didn't like my golden arches before, but that looks cool. So now we're going to meet at McDonald's. So he's going this way, I'm going this way, and we want to meet right in the middle, okay, or at the midpoint. So let's say on the highway, I'm at mile marker, let's say 50, okay? I'm at the 50 mile marker. And let's say that he is at the 200 mile marker. Yeah, that'll work. So he's at the 200 mile marker. And I don't want to drive all the way to his place. Well, first of all, how far would I have to drive if I drove all the way to his place? From 50 to 200, so 200 minus 50 is 150. I would have to go 150 miles, and he would have to do the same thing if he was going to come all the way to my house. Well, neither one of us want to drive that far, so we're going to meet at McDonald's in the middle. So what mile marker would we meet at? Well, there's a couple ways you could do this, okay? A lot of people say, okay, well, the whole distance, let's see. The whole distance is 200 minus 50, which is 150. But I don't want to drive the whole way. I only want to drive half the way. So I'll split that in half, and what is that? That's 75 miles. But am I at the 75 mile marker? No, it's 75 miles from my house. So if I start at 50, if I start at the 50 mile marker and add a 75, that'll put me at the 125 mile marker. So this would be the 125 mile marker. Now that's an okay way to do it. Put MI for miles. That's an okay way to do it. All right, that's where we would meet at the 125 mile marker. That's where the McDonald's is. But that's a lot of stuff to go through. Let's get rid of that. And let's find a little better way. We're still going to get the same exact answer. Okay, but it's a little bit more... that's just easier. I was trying to think of a word. Couldn't think of it. But anyway, it's a little more straightforward to find. So if you look at it, watch this. I'll just show you how to do it. I won't make you think about it. But you could, if you wanted to. You could pause and think of a better way to do this if you want to. It might be a good idea. But I'm just going to show you right now. What if I took the 50 and I added it to the 200? Well, what does that give me? It gives me 250. Well, that doesn't give me the halfway point. That doesn't really help at all. But look at this 250. You remember what the answer was, right? It was 125. What can I do with that 250? We're both going half the distance, so watch what I do. If I divide that by 2, that gives me 125. Now, that's quite a bit less work than what we had to do before. So that's 125. That's an easy way to find the midpoint. So let's do this. Let's get rid of these numbers. Let's put some X's in there because we don't want to just do it with 50 and 200. We want to be able to do it no matter what numbers you have in there. And also we want to be able to do that whether you have negative numbers or positive numbers. So I'm going to call this X1 and I'm going to call this X2 and I want to find the midpoint. I'll put MP for midpoint. I'll just put an equal sign and when we come up with it, we'll put it right here. So what did I do to those two numbers, that 50 and that 200? Well, I added them together, didn't I? So let's do that. So I'm going to take the X1, I'm going to add it to the X2. But that wasn't my midpoint. How did I find that midpoint? I took that number, remember 50 plus 200 is 250, then I divided it by 2. So I divide that by 2. That is my midpoint. So I can actually just take this thing right here and move it there, and there you go. That's my midpoint. That's the midpoint formula. Now that's just going horizontally, okay? The same thing would work up and down if I went along the y-axis up and down. So the y would be, the midpoint to the y going up and down would be y1 plus y2 over 2. So what if you had this? What if you had an x and a y coordinate like we did with the distance formula? Like, uh-oh, we're back to this again. Yes, we are. Tell you what, I'm going to stay in the first quadrant, so I'm going to pull this over about like that, if that's okay with you. Let's center this up a little bit. We're just going to work in the first quadrant here. So let's make the line green again. It should look very similar to what we did before, but we're finding something completely different. We're not finding the length of this line segment this time. That would be the distance formula. What we're trying to do is we're trying to find What is this point right here? That would be in the middle, okay? It would split this segment into two equal parts. The midpoint, we're trying to find the midpoint of this segment. So we're not finding how long it is, we're finding out the actual point, how far over on the x, how far up on the y is that point right there. That's going to be the midpoint. So let's call this point something. We could call this like AB, like we did before with the distance. But what are the coordinates? What is the ordered pair for this point right here? Well, we don't know. I haven't measured anything out. I haven't put any numbers in here, but just in general, what would it be? Well, I have to go over x and I have to go up a y. So I would go x1 and I would go y1. What would this point over here be? BB, all right? So you go over x2 and you go up y2. So x2, y2. So this is one point. This is our second point. That's why it's x1, y1. That's why this is x2, y2. What we want to do is find the midpoint. Well, go colors again. Watch this. What we're going to do is find the midpoint of the vertical, and we're going to find the midpoint of the horizontal. Because we know how to do that going along one direction like this. So how did I find the midpoint along the horizontal? Well, remember what this point was, by the way? This was x1, how far up? y2. So how did I find this? Well, I added up the x's, x1 plus x2, and then I divided by 2. So that would be the midpoint of this red line. So that would put me probably about right in there somewhere. Okay, that would be the midpoint of this line. How do I find the midpoint of this vertical line right here? Well, this time it's going up and down, so I'll add the y's together. So let me put a little arrow here. So this would be y1 plus y2 over 2. So that's the midpoint of this. So that would be about right there. Looks about halfway. So watch. If I go halfway along here, it hits there. If I go halfway along here, it hits right there. Now check it out. Halfway along here, look where it puts us. It puts us at the midpoint of AB. So how do I put this all together? Well, glad you asked. Here it is. Let's do this in green instead. We'll stay with our little color scheme here. So here is our midpoint. How do we find the midpoint of AB? Well, we go halfway along the x and halfway along the y. And what would that give us? It would give us x1 plus x2 over 2. And then the second part of our ordered pair would be y1 plus y2 over 2. And that right there is our midpoint formula. Notice, it's a point. It's not a distance. It's not a length. It's an actual point. It's got an ordered pair. It's got an x part and it's got a y part to our ordered pair. And you could write x2 plus x1, but does it really matter? No, because when I add, it doesn't matter what order it's in. I just like to say 1 plus 2. All right, so you take the two x's, you add them up divided by 2, then you take the two y's, you add them up divided by 2, put them in an ordered pair, bang, you're done. Let's do an example. And let me flip the page here a little bit. And this is on page 28. It's example 4. If you want to follow along in the book. It says find the midpoint of ST. So it says find the midpoint, I'll just put MP, of line segment ST. Now, here's the information. They tell you what point S is, and it's -6, 3. And they tell you what point T is, and that would be 1, 0. And they just ask you to find the midpoint. Well, know what the midpoint is. I said this for the distance formula. I would always write down the formula first, especially when you're first doing these things, because you're going to have to remember what these formulas are. You're going to have them memorized. So what is the midpoint formula? It's actually pretty easy. Remember, it's a point. It's an ordered pair. So we have an x and a y. How do we find the x? We just add the two x's together and divide by 2. How do we find the y? We add the two y's together and divide by 2. All right, so there's our midpoint formula. Now we're just going to go ahead and apply it. So let's find the midpoint of ST. We write it as an ordered pair, and then we add up the x's. That's what it says right here. Take the x values and add them up. Which ones are the x's? It would be this one, and this one. So we add those together. So what would it be? It'd be negative 6 plus 1. And what do we do after we add them together? We divide it by 2 because we're finding the midpoint, the halfway point. And then you do the same thing with the y's. This is the y and this is the y. So you add those together. So it's 3 plus 0 over 2. And now you simplify it and you work it out. Negative 6 plus 1 is negative 5. Now, these aren't going to, it's not like the absolute value thing with the distance formula and the squares. Okay, you can get negatives for this, absolutely. So it's negative 5 over 2, comma, and then 3 plus 0 is 3 over 2, which is 3 halves. So it's negative 5 halves, positive 3 halves. That would be the midpoint between these 2 points. You don't have to graph it out. That's what's nice about this. That's why we learn the formula, so you don't have to graph it all the time. So that's the midpoint formula. This is an example of how to use it. Pretty straightforward. Okay, let's do another example where it's a little bit different. They don't give you the 2 endpoints. See, this right here is an endpoint. I'll just put PT, and this right here is also an endpoint. On this next example, they're going to give you one endpoint, and they're going to give you the midpoint. You have to find the other endpoint. So let's do that. Okay, here's a problem straight from the book. I typed it out so make it a little easier to read. Let's see what's going on. It says find the coordinates of J, of point J. So we're trying to find this point. If K, which is negative 1, 2, is the midpoint. So let's do this. Let's mark that down. So the midpoint, I'll put a little colon there, is point K. It says K is the midpoint. All right, so we'll put K, and it's negative 1, 2. What are we trying to find? We're trying to find the coordinates of J. So I'm going to put a J. I'm going to just leave this empty for a second. And what else do they tell us? It's the midpoint of JL, and L has a coordinate, put L right here, of 3, negative 5. I think it's a little easier like this. So what are they giving you? This is actually the midpoint. This is the one that's in the middle. To tell you the truth, if you wanted to, you could do this just to make it look a little bit better. We'll actually put the midpoint in the middle of these things so you can kind of visualize it a little bit better. So they tell you a midpoint and they tell you one of the endpoints, right? This right here is an endpoint and this right here is an endpoint. Problem is, we don't know what that endpoint is. So let's do this. Since we don't know what it is, the first one will be x, we'll just call it x1, and we'll call this y1. So this is what we're trying to solve for right there. That's what we're trying to find. So let's stick stuff into our midpoint formula. Let's write the midpoint formula down again. I'm going to show you kind of a longer way to go through it, and then maybe we can kind of see what's going on and then do a little shorter way. So let's write this. x1 plus, let's write that a little bit nicer. So x1 plus x2 over 2, and this is going to be y1 plus y2 over 2. Now, since we know this is our endpoint, so this would be our x1. This right here would be our x2. This is our y1 because it's one endpoint. This is our second endpoint, so this would be our y2. And this would be the midpoint right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug some stuff in and see what we get. So what is the midpoint? Well, it's negative 1, 2. So I'm going to write negative 1, 2. All I'm doing is substituting what I know for the midpoint. I'm just putting it into that spot right there. Equals. And now I'm just going to fill in some stuff that I know here. x1 plus x2. Well, I don't know what x1 is, so I'll just write it x1. Plus, what is the x2? Well, look at this point right here. This was the x2, so I'll put a 3 right there. And what does our formula say we do? It says we divide by 2. Do the same thing with the y. Don't know the y1, so I'll write it as y1. Plus the y2 is negative 5, so I'll put plus negative 5. And that's over 2. And you're like, well, that's more confusing than anything. Well, watch what I do here. This shouldn't be too bad. If you look at this, all the x's are equal to each other. See, this stuff right here is equal to the x over here, which is that number. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here, and in blue, I'm going to write x plus 3 over 2 equals negative 1, because those two would be equal to each other. The x's are equal and the y's are equal. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this and set it equal to the y over here. See, I'll set those y's equal to each other. Now, instead of putting y plus -5, let's just put y minus 5 and put that over 2. And what is this equal to? It's equal to 2. And now it's basic simple algebra. I hope. We'll see. Let's do this in a different color too. Let's get rid of the 2 first of all. That's the first thing I would do. So I'd multiply both sides by 2 so they cancel out. Come over here and multiply that by 2. I'll scooch this up, give me some room. So now if I bring everything down, let's go back to blue. So if I bring everything down, I've got x plus 3 equals -1 times 2 is -2. One little step, subtract 3 from both sides, so x equals -5. So that's the x part right there. That's that part right there that I just found. It's -5. That's one of my endpoints. Let's go ahead and do the same type of math over to this one. First thing I'm going to do is multiply by 2. I'll follow my steps because I'll give you a little shortcut in a second. We multiply by 2 on both sides, and then we bring this down. Y minus 5 equals 4. Add a 5 to both sides, and then y equals 9. So look at what I just found. I just found the y. So I've got -5 for the x, and I've got 9 for the y. So my final answer, I'm almost done. My final answer is the endpoint, and it's -5, 9. And that would be point J, and that's what they want you to find. Now let's take a look at this. What did I end up doing? Let's see. Let's take a look at the... Let's write this down again. Watch. Midpoint. Let's not do that there. Let's scooch this down. Tell you what, I'm going to copy all the stuff we started with. Let's copy all of this. Probably included a bunch of other stuff, but I'll have to get rid of some things. Okay, that's all right. We'll keep that. Let's get rid of these circle things. Sorry, I'm taking so long on this. All right, let's do this another way. If you noticed, basically, what did you just do here? We took this x plus 3, right, which was one of the endpoints, and we set it equal to the midpoint. Look at the math that we did. Basically, you can do this in 2 steps. Watch. What I did is I took... let's see, I took this x plus 3 right here, and I'm sorry, I took the midpoint, and what did I do? I multiplied it by 2. So if you take the midpoint and you multiply it by 2, and then you subtract a 3 from it, then you've got your answer. So watch what I could have done. I could have just stayed right here and said, all right, here's my midpoint. So I'm going to do the complete opposite of this. Instead of adding and dividing, what I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply, and then I'm going to subtract. Okay, so let's check that out. What am I going to do here? I'm going to multiply by what? So I divided by 2. I'm going to multiply by 2. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to multiply by 2, which is a -2, and then I'm going to subtract this number from it. -2 minus 3 is -5, and that's the x part of my answer. Does the same thing work here? Absolutely. Watch. If I take this midpoint and double it, multiply it by 2, that gives me a 4, and then I'm going to subtract a -5. That's adding a 5. So 4 plus 5 is 9, and I've got my answer. And you don't have to go through all this stuff. This stuff was just to show you how to get to it. Let me go through it real quick without all the junk around it. Oops, scooched down too much. All right, there we go. So let's try this again. Watch what I could do. I could take the midpoint, the -1, just multiply it by 2, and then subtract the endpoint from it. So that's a -2, and then subtract this number from it, and that will give you a -5. That's the x part of my endpoint. Now do the same thing with the y. Take this and multiply it by 2. So I take that number, whatever it is, I multiply it by 2, and then I subtract this number right here from it, a -5. Remember, I subtract a negative, which is plus. This is 4 plus 5, which is 9, and then my endpoint is -5, 9. I know that seems a little confusing right now, but After you get used to them and you do a few of these, it starts making a little bit of sense. Okay, so what do? You take the midpoint, you multiply it by 2, and subtract the endpoint from it. Do it to both of those. That's how you can get the missing endpoint that we didn't have in the first place. Okay, sorry it's taking so long, but there's just a lot of stuff in here. So let's finish this off. This is we're gonna do one more example, then we'll do one quick other thing when we finished. Okay, so find PQ. We're finding the length of that right there. Find PQ if Q is the midpoint of PR. So this is right in the middle. It splits this into 2 equal parts. That's the key to this. That's the key to understanding midpoint, is the midpoint divides these 2 segments into 2 equal segments. So what's true about this segment and this segment? Well, they have to be equal to each other. So guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to come over here and I'm going to set them equal to each other. So I'm going to go 9y minus 2 equals 14 plus 5y. And I'm going to solve for y. Now the problem says find PQ, this length right here, but I got to find what y is in order to find that. Once I find y, just plug it in and then I'm done. So let's do y. Let's subtract a 5y from both sides. We're going to be doing this kind of arithmetic. There's algebra all year long, so hope you follow along on this. All right, and let's see, that canceled, that canceled. That's going to give me a 4y, and that's going to give me a 16. Divide by 4, and y is 4. But I'm not done. That's not my answer. The question says find PQ. So I have to take that 4. I got to plug it in for this y. So it's 9 times 4 minus 2. 9 4s are 36, minus 2 is 34. So the length of PQ is 34. What if I ask you the length of QR? I wouldn't have to do any other math. All I got to know is that if this is the midpoint, these 2 segments are the same. So if this is 34, then this is going to be 34 as well. What if I ask you to solve for PR? Well, that'd be easy because look, this is 34. This is 34. Just add the 2 together, and that's 68, and that's the length of PR. Okay, we're almost finished. This will be the last thing. So right here, I've got a line segment. I call this M because this is the midpoint. This is basically just a definition. If I had a line or another line segment, to tell you the truth, and watch, if this line actually went through the midpoint, all right, let's say this is a line. It keeps on going. If this blue line goes through the midpoint of this line segment, we call this blue line right here, we call this a segment bisector. Segment bisector. We're going to be using this quite a bit, a little bit later on, not so much right now, but since they're talking about midpoint, they just introduced this. So I could bisect this segment with a line. I could take a plane if I wanted to, okay? I could take a plane, and if it goes through the midpoint of this segment, that plane could be a bisector as well. I have other things. I could have another line segment that bisects, okay, like this, okay, and it doesn't even have to, the line segment doesn't have to be bisected, but watch. I could have this line segment right here. If it goes through M, this line segment, call it line segment AB, it bisects PQ at M, all right? So it's a segment bisector. All right, that's it. Again, sorry for the length of this video. You can imagine if I tried to put both of those things onto one video, how long it would be. So thanks for watching, and good luck with your homework the next time we have class.